Hello, gardening friends. Beautiful day out, right? Slightly overcast, but perfect to work in the garden. Not too hot, not too cold. It's just what we wish was every day, but it isn't. I'm gonna do something today that, if you've been following me, I've maybe said I'm never gonna do again, and I'm gonna do it. But I'm gonna tell you why I'm doing it. I am planting a big leaf colored hydrangea. You know, for years, there were many I had tried at different times. They didn't necessarily work. Either the location wasn't good, maybe the harshness of our climate changes during winter to summer, because we have vast climates here in both summer and winter. It can be extra humid, extra hot, really windy in the summer. In the winter, it can also be anywhere from just kind of a mild between 0 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit to -20, -30, extreme polar vortexes too, with a lot of wind. So sometimes it can be extreme, to say the least, really. And I think in the past, when I've done certain varieties of colored hydrangeas, some of the kind of hot, trendy ones, they don't always do the best just in every environment, even if your zone matches up. I think that's the big thing. Just because a zone is in your planting zone, not every plant is always gonna work for you, right? But today I'm gonna talk about why I'm removing a couple hydrangeas behind me, because they didn't work the best here. We're gonna talk about that. Light has changed slightly, sunlight has changed with some tree growth, and it just isn't the best place for certain ones, but I think it's gonna be a really good place for two new ones, although, you know, maybe it won't be. That's the fun part about gardening, is we learn, we adapt, and we grow. I have a lot of things that work well in my yard. I always am finding things that don't work too, and that's the fun part. So I'm gonna take you along as I'm gonna transplant some. It's a little late in the season, but I'm not worried. We're still gonna be able to do it. And we're gonna kind of just show the ins and outs. This is kind of a slight something that isn't working, but also something I hope does work, and I think that's fun to see, right? So we are across my driveway. So my entry is right there. Look at all the beautiful blooms up there right now and textures going on. We have my helper, of course, #1, Kip here. This is an area that sometimes feels slightly neglected just because I don't come over to this side of the yard a lot. I go to my backyard a lot along the pathway. And I would love an entry eventually that kind of more mimics that entry point, but it's an odd area. So right here, it's against an old arborvitae hedge. I mean, we're talking from the 1970s, probably 60s or 70s these were planted. And right behind me is a big old pin oak, and it has grown even more, especially in the last few years with some rain we've gotten. It's kind of even gotten more dense, and it's really pushed out. And the thing is, it's made this area that I used to say was mostly sun into really a mostly shade with maybe just a few hours of sunlight every day in the middle of the day. So that's really kind of adapted to what I've been putting here. And even I will say, this could be the last year I put mandevilla here. They're gonna do well, I think, this year. They're already putting on new growth, but mandevilla like that full hot sun. They don't always necessarily get it here. I think one of the important things I've always learned is, even though a lot of my yard, the trees have been there for a long time, any of the ones I've planted haven't made a huge difference yet as far as shade goes. Our yards can still kind of evolve and adapt every year, and so accounting for that by watching our sunlight, that can really change the beds we put together. And so this is one of those beds where I, in the past, kind of in my head, put it together as full sun. And over the years, since I live here, I wasn't always watching it the most, but I was starting to watch that certain things don't do as well. All the boxwood in it, they can do well in quite a bit of shade and sun. So they've been doing great both times. I have some hellebore here, they do pretty well. I have some allium here, they have been getting a little bit more sparse. Again, not full sun. So let's talk about what I am going to grow, which is some big leaf varieties. Now, I haven't grown a big leaf hydrangea for quite a few years. So these are a macrophylla, as opposed to arborensis, which is an Annabelle, or as opposed to a panicle hydrangea, which is our bobo hydrangeas that I'm gonna move, and the limelights I've had. I usually grow arborensis and panicle just because they're paniculata, because they bloom on old new wood, they're very easy. Big leaf, or macrophylla here, I should call them. They bloom on old wood. So you wanna do any pruning on these directly after their bloom this year, or whatever year we're in. Then they're gonna set their blooms for the next year on that old wood. So if you prune these in the spring, most likely you're pruning off the previous year's wood growth, which is the year-old wood, and that's where they would bloom. So the big thing with these type of hydrangeas is to remember they prune differently, and you prune them adapting to making sure, knowing what type of hydrangea they are, which is a macrophylla. So these specifically, I'm really excited about these. I just picked these up at the store. I was going through and I was like, you know what? It was an impulse buy, why not? They're the Seaside Serenade, which in my backyard, I have a Seaside Serenade bar harbor. These are a Cape Cod. So they have that beautiful color that we all know and love of the East Coast, but they're gonna be a little bit hardier. They're hardy down to zone 4, which I really like. They can take a little bit of light, which I like. They can get a couple hours here because they're partial sun, partial shade. And they're gonna, I think, adapt very well to this soil. So this soil is mostly neutral. I will adjust that here as I plant them just because I think anytime you can, it's great to give them a little bit of a oomph in some acidity since they do love that, and I do not have acidic soil. When I go to transplant, especially when we're getting into a time of year where it could be a little bit more stressful on the plant, I make sure to have something with me, in this case a trug, just my garden trug I use for different things. This is what I'm gonna put it directly into because you want as much soil to stay around that root ball as you can. If you want the most minimal stress, you want as big of area around the root ball as you can. You know, when they transplant extra large trees, they get massive root balls and they really tightly put burlap around it to try to keep those roots as intact as possible. The closer in you go, the more you're gonna stress the plant because you're cutting off more roots. It's really kind of a give and take. The thing is, I'm not too worried, again, like I said, about the stress. These have not been blooming. They have not really put in too much growth. And do you notice how easy that was to pull up? That right away shows me that in the last few years, these have not done a lot of growth underground because they're not getting what they need, which I did know. So even just with one push-up, look how little of root growth they really did. This right away is telling me this was not the perfect place for these. I obviously was not watching the sunlight quite correctly as much as I wish I could. But do you see how if you put it in something like a trug, as opposed to just carrying it or accidentally dropping it, where more soil would come off, this allows me to transport it with that soil as attached as I can. But let's actually just go ahead and go plant this in a little bit different spot, and I'll kind of talk about why that's probably a better spot. I'm bringing this over to the south side, actually, of my garden shed that kind of sits directly behind my house. I can view this spot, and it's always been kind of a thorn in my side, really, from the house, because it's kind of a hard spot. I have added drip line because it stays a little too dry for almost anything. Further kind of to that side you go, it gets more shade. Further to this side, it gets more sun. So this is a perfect spot to put the boho hydrangea. Now, I'm moving them from a spot that I said gets too much shade. Bobo can take some partial shade. At my mom's house, I have them on our north side, but they get a lot of afternoon, late afternoon, evening sun. Over there, they get only about 1 hour to 2 hours, kind of in the middle of the day, and it's dappled. Here, they're gonna get a lot more some direct sun, which they love full sun. So this is a really good spot. It drains really well. Again, it has neutral soil. So to counteract that, I'm of course gonna use biotome. This is, again, not anything to do with acidity. But this is a great way to kind of just get the roots acclimated. Since I'm transplanting this plant, I'm counting it as a brand new plant. So I have a hole already started. I'm gonna put biotone right in the bottom. And you're gonna see that I'm gonna do this exact same thing for the brand new ones. Now, I am putting some holly tone. So, hydrangea in general, they love a little bit of acidity and they love a fertilizer that can kind of be a little bit more prone for acidic plants, like hollies. Holly tone works great. It's again a great Espoma product. Now, these have nothing to do with color. Sometimes we, do stuff with the acid or soil acidifier to change color of hydrangea. Boho hydrangea, they're white. They get a slight blush on them later in the season. Has nothing to do with the acid. It's just something that any hydrangea does like. So I'm gonna actually just pick up this plant now. Again, this root growth has hardly changed from when I planted it. I'm gonna put it right here in the hole at the same level it was at. But what I am gonna do, since we're getting into a warmer time of year, I'm gonna water it really well before I backfill with soil. I just wanna make sure this is gonna start off really well moistened. I wanna make sure the roots are well moistened, then I'm gonna backfill. Pretty much all that water now has drained really well. That's the big thing I'm also always checking. I wanna know how the drainage is. Now, I don't live in areas, once in a while I wish I did, but no, I don't. We all have our own problems. I don't live in areas where water really ever sits. It drains very well for me. Sometimes though, too well is the thing. So, that's one way to check though. If you're worried about drainage, fill a hole with water and see how quickly it drains. If it's sitting there for too long, that's gonna help you kind of know what plants can work well there. This is draining well, and hydrangeas want good draining soil, but they do need ample moisture and water. If they don't get it, that's when they can start looking wilted during the heat of the summer, but also don't always do the best production of flowers, or the flowers can look burned pretty quickly because they're not getting the water. So I'm just backfilling now with the soil, and then I'll water again. I'm just finishing up now on the second one that I brought over. So this is the second one I was transplanting, the other bobo. and I'm watering it well. Now, the other reason we water it well, both when we put it in the hole, we want a saturated plant to start with, but then after we get the soil put back around it, you want any of those air bubbles that were, with that soil as we were putting it in to dissipate, for that soil to kind of go back and get rid of the air bubbles, because air bubbles can create little dry pockets around roots. You don't want that, that can actually dry out the plant. So I water it well 2 times, especially when I'm transplanting. When I'm planting, we'll go talk about that right now. When I'm planting a new plant, I'll pay a little bit less attention to how much water I put in the hole, only because I start with a really well-watered plant. When a plant is in the ground, you can water it well, but then it's not fun to dig it out always because it can be a little too muddy. In this case, whenever I'm starting with plants that have been in containers because I just purchased them, I water them really well in the container because I want that plant to be fully saturated when it goes into the ground. Sometimes when a plant gets really dry, it can be hard for it to soak up water well. You want to make sure it's well saturated before you even go to plant it. So when I have my hole dug, what I am noticing, while we've had some good rains, this is not any too wet right here. And these hydrangeas do like some moisture. So I thankfully have drip line here. I will make sure to put an emitter right to this shrub. And that's really going to help it, because without the proper moisture, it can really start hurting the plant. And obviously I'll water it as much as I can to keep it healthy, but over its life, it still could need that supplemental water, even when it's established. That's the big thing with some hydrangeas. So I'm really gonna make sure I put in good biotone. I wanna get this really well acclimated, and then a good amount of the hollytone so I can give it some of that acid-loving fertilizer that it really wants. This is a great time too, if you ever feel like your soil is lacking, to amend with like 50% of a good compost. This area I have in the past put compost on, and actually what I do here is I leave all my leaves that fall, I mow them and chop them up and mow them and blow them onto this area. So it's kind of creating its own compost really slowly over time, which I like. Now I'm gonna try to get this out gently. There we go. And you can see here, I want that root ball to stay somewhat together. Now, it doesn't have tight roots that sometimes I show, so I'm not gonna really take off too much. I'm gonna take off just a little bit of the soil. But since this is not tightly wound up around or encircling, I'm gonna leave it fairly as is and try to just plant it at the same level. I don't want that crown to sit below the soil because I don't want it to become waterlogged. That could also cause rot if you plant it too deep. What I am gonna do now is just make sure I can put that soil back around it. Now again, I did not water this hole, you can do that, but I'm starting with a very well watered and saturated root ball itself on the plant. I'm on to the second one now, and again, I can tell it's well saturated. It doesn't have any too tight of roots, so I'm not gonna really break it up too much. Just take a little bit off of this bottom growth. You know, what I notice with a lot of container grown plants, and this is a beautifully grown plant, they sometimes are grown with a lighter soil mix, a little bit more of kind of a mulch or bark-like texture. And that's because for growers, when these are sitting on a lot growing, they have usually drip line to each one. They want them to drain really well so they become waterlogged. So sometimes you just want to make sure that means it's going to drain really well in your soil too. So you really have to watch that moisture on them and make sure you're giving them what they need. Because in the middle of the summer, if you're not getting at least an inch a week, you're going to definitely need to water these. And even with an inch a week, I still think in between that, which by the way, if you're getting an inch a week of rain, I envy you, because that is not what we get here anymore usually. Sometimes on average we will, but in the middle of summer we definitely don't get that. So the big thing to remember with these is the type of hydrangea is what's going to make a difference for its care, for its pruning longevity. Now, if you're worried about the types of hydrangeas, I have a post on my website all about hydrangeas. Big leaf to arborensis, paniculata, macrophylla. And that's because I want you to be able to understand the differences between them so you can have really the best possible outcome in your garden. Once I have all the soil around this, which I can tell I do, I'm gonna water it well. And again, I will get that drip line hooked up to it. But even with drip line, don't always just trust it. You need to go out and check it. Sometimes I think we're too trusting in some of those things. If you don't go out and test it yourself, see how much water it's getting, make sure it's not getting too much, too little, you know, that can really be the good or bad of how it does. So these in time should get around 4 by 4 foot. I love that over here. I'm not gonna really keep them any shorter. I want them to get as big as they can. To me, 4 foot wide, 4 foot tall will look beautiful over here, especially if I can get them to bloom well. Something you may notice about me is not everything is always prim and proper and perfect. This bed behind me, for instance, it's across the driveway. No one ever walks past it. So I try to do the most beneficial. It is not like a front landscaped bed in front of a front porch, which even there I probably do the same method. I have a lot of leaves on it that I chop up and leave from the winter. I try to do a method where I'm not doing too much to the bed. It looks really good kind of as you're driving in from the house. You know, it can look a little bit messier as you get up to it. But not every bed has to be perfect. I think we're too used to this perfect cut and dry landscaping. Instead, what I want to do is leave the leaves on it. I want to promote a self-composting system. I want to promote good soil health. And instead of always having everything kind of bare, exposed, a lot of mulch, I try to create that self-symbiotic circle. So what I want to do is show you, so here are now some microphylla hydrangeas. Let's go look at a couple others I have so you can see the differences. One area I really never show is, well, you can see my irises are pretty much done, but this is kind of along one side of my garden shed and going around the other side. So these are arborensis or smooth Annabelle hydrangea. I cut them pretty much down, maybe to like 6 inches every year, go around this arborvitae, and there's a whole bunch more. So these are on a northeast corner, both more north kind of direct and a little bit more eastern direct on 2 corners. And it's an area that no one else ever sees other than me, but I come out and do a lot of cuttings from this, and they're putting on a lot of their buds right now. So these will bloom kind of more in early July, usually late June sometimes. And these, what's great is they do love more shade. Annabelle in full sun can get a lot of burning to go on them. They can dry out really quickly, but when they get mostly shade, they do really well. And what's nice is they bloom on new wood. So you can cut them down to 6 inches. They come back into a big shrub. They're easy to take cuttings from. They're easy to give as gifts, take starts of, and they just do well. For a little bit more direction, this is right beside my vegetable garden. So we can walk through the vegetable garden now and go to some others I want to talk about. Hydrangea in general, they're one of the things that we all love. They're iconic. They're iconic of summer. They're kind of that perfect American feeling farmhouse sometimes. But the thing is, what I do find is all hydrangea kind of, they don't like to be completely dry, right? So in Iowa sometimes, when we go through droughts in the middle of summer, you definitely have to think about the watering. I've learned that with these that are in a very exposed area. So these are my 18 limelight hydrangeas. Limelight are a paniculata, panicle hydrangea, meaning they come to a point. They do kind of have that beautiful white color, but also get a kind of a nice green color early on, and then they do dry beautifully indoors too for arrangements or just to keep in a bouquet kind of over the winter if you went to in a dried state. What I do with these, because they can get very tall, 8 to 10 foot, I planted them where they can get that tall. So right now they're on the backside of a woodward arborvitae hedge, but they're now at the point where they grow up over that hedge every year, and I trim them down to about 4 foot. I never go below 4 foot because I want them to have a very strong stem and sturdy stem at that 4 foot level, so all the growth they put on every year can be held up and it doesn't flop over. They get big blooms, you want them to stand proud. So I find letting them grow to about 4 foot and then keeping them there, that allows for all that new growth. Now again, they bloom on new wood beautifully, new or old wood. They're really easy to prune. That's what's great about panicle hydrangeas. What you don't get is any of the color. They're not a mop head hydrangea, so you don't get that full big round snowball look. They're more of that kind of pointed hydrangea. So it just depends how you like them, but they love full sun. They do want moderate moisture. So you have to take that into account. As we go around the corner from this, we're gonna go through my pathway. We're gonna come up to some hydrangeas that usually people are surprised are in full sun, but I'll explain why they do well. So up here at the back side of my kind of aloe and agave table are some what look like an Annabelle hydrangea, but they're the same idea, Seaside Serenade, but these are a Bar Harbor hydrangea. So I don't know if these are still growing, but what they are is kind of a hardier or more sturdy Annabelle. They don't flop over, and they do very well in full sun. Only if we get into a pretty extreme drought do they start getting the burned edges on them, as opposed to traditional Annabelle hydrangea that would kind of get very wilty in full sun. When they dry out, don't look happy in the sun. These do really well out in the middle of my yard where they get mostly sun all day. But what I do again have to do is supplement with some water if we're getting into a really dry period. Some years I don't supplement with water and their flowers just will brown slightly quicker. The plants still look really good. Just like other Annabelle though, these are very easy to transplant starts of, cuttings from, super easy. Limelights, you can do cuttings. They're not quite as easy as an arborensis like this, Annabelle's, or in this case, the Bar Harbor hydrangea. But they do really well. So that's a few different hydrangeas I have around my yard. You can see mostly I just did 2 types. I mostly did arborensis and paniculata. So now I'm adding in that microphylla. I really do think since it's a hardier version, that newer variety, I think it's gonna do really well over there. I'm excited to watch it grow. I'm excited someday to have blooms to cut and have a beautiful big arrangement indoors. That's why I plan, that's what I look forward to, right? This year I've been doing good at bringing in a lot more flowers, so you can see everything right now is still just blooming. The peonies are mostly over, but there's still a few blooms to pick, which I love. The above and beyond roses, so happy this year. With all the rain we had last year and we've had some decent rain this year, it's been a great year for kind of lush growth on everything. So I hope that's some fun hydrangea facts. I don't know if it isn't. Hopefully you can kind of get excited and inspired because I know we all love hydrangea. They're one of my favorites, as they are kind of everyone's. After peonies, I think hydrangea is that next one that we all look forward to. So happy gardening. Let me know what you're planting, what you're excited about. You know I'm gonna do more, so I can't wait to hear what you're doing too.